The first time Eliza Hargrove heard her own name spoken gently, like it was something worth saying. She was standing in the middle of a Montana trading post in the autumn of 1874, covered in trail dust and holding a broken wagon wheel, spoke like it was the last solid thing left in her world. She had not expected anyone to notice her at all. That was the way her life had always worked. She moved through rooms and days and years like smoke, present enough to serve a purpose, invisible enough that no one ever thought to ask what she needed. Her husband Gerald had been that way. Her father before him had been that way. Even the women she had known in St. Louis, the ones who called themselves her friends, had looked right through her in the particular way people do when they have already decided that a woman is simply a background feature of their own more important lives. But the man who stepped through the trading post door that gray October morning was not the kind of man who looked through anyone. He had to duck his head to clear the frame, which told you something immediately. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that made the doorway seem like it had been built for smaller creatures, and his arms, bare from the elbows down where he had rolled his sleeves against the cold, were roped with muscle in the way that only comes from years of actual labor, not from showing off, but from surviving. His hair was dark chestnut, long enough to curl slightly at the collar of his flannel shirt, and his jaw carried a beard that was full but kept, the kind a man maintains not out of vanity, but out of simple practicality. His eyes, when they finally landed on her, were the deep, steady gray of a winter sky just before the first real snow of the season. He looked at her the way no one had looked at her in a very long time, directly, openly, as if she were a full and complete person standing in front of him rather than an obstacle or a convenience. "You all right, ma'am?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had spent long, quiet months talking to mountains and rivers instead of people, and it carried in it none of the impatience or distraction she was accustomed to from men who asked after her welfare purely out of social obligation. Eliza looked down at the wagon, spoke in her hands. She had not even realized she was still holding it. "My wagon lost a wheel outside of town," she said. "Coming down the eastern trail." "How far back?" "About 3 miles, maybe closer to 4. He set down the sack of supplies he had been carrying across one shoulder. It landed on the trading post counter with a sound like a sack of river stones, and turned to old Pete Murdoch behind the counter, who had been watching the whole exchange with the mild interest of a man who had seen everything and was rarely surprised by any of it. "Pete," he said, "you got a good spare wheel and an axle brace?" "Got both," Pete said. "Cost you?" "Put it on my account." That was the first thing Eliza learned about him. He solved problems without making theater of it. He did not ask her whether she wanted help, or whether she could handle it herself, or whether she had a man somewhere who ought to be handling it for her. He simply saw a problem and addressed it with the same economy of motion he likely applied to everything else in his life. His name was Cole Briggs. She learned that on the walk out to the wagon, after he had loaded the spare wheel and the brace onto a mule he had tied at the post's hitching rail. He offered it plainly, without the usual Western preamble of where a man was from and who his people were, and how many head of cattle he ran, all the masculine arithmetic that passed for introduction in most of the territory. "Cole Briggs," he said, extending a hand. "Eliza Hargrove," she said, and shook it, because she had never been the kind of woman who needed to flutter about a handshake. His grip was firm and warm and brief. They walked east along the main road out of Harlan Creek, the small Montana settlement where Eliza had been making for since leaving the stagecoach depot in Billings 4 days ago. The mule walked stolidly between them. The aspens along the road had gone the color of new butter, and the air carried the particular bite of high country autumn, clean and sharp and utterly indifferent to human trouble. "You traveling alone?" he asked after a while. "Yes." He did not comment on this. He did not tell her it was dangerous or inadvisable or inappropriate. He simply filed the information away in whatever quiet place he filed things and kept walking. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Harlan Creek for now. I have a letter from a cousin who says there may be work at the dry goods store. Agnes Pruitt's place. You know it? Been coming through Harlan Creek for about 6 years. Agnes is a fair woman. Works her people hard but pays them honest." Eliza absorbed this. Fair, hard work, honest pay. These were not things she'd been accustomed to in St. Louis, where the work she had done in her husband's household had been neither acknowledged nor compensated, where she had been expected to be grateful simply for the fact of having a roof, and a man who did not raise his hand to her, as if the bar for a good life was set at the height of a grave, and anything above it was luxury. Gerald Hargrove had died of a fever in the spring of that year, 1874, and Eliza had sat at his bedside for the final 3 days of his life, and tried very hard to feel the grief that a wife was supposed to feel, and had found mostly a vast, flat silence where the grief was supposed to be. She had not been glad he was dying. She had not wished it. But she had looked at his slack face against the pillow and realized with the quiet horror of absolute clarity that she had spent 8 years of her life accommodating a man who had never once, not in 8 years, asked her what she wanted. Not what she wanted for dinner or what she wanted to do on a Sunday afternoon. Not what she wanted from her life or from their marriage or from the future that stretched out ahead of them both. He had simply assumed, as men of his type always assumed, that what he wanted was what they both wanted, and that her role was to want it more gracefully and with less fuss. She had sold the house in St. Louis. She had packed what could fit in a single trunk. She had written to her cousin Ruth in Harlan Creek, Montana, and she had gotten on a westbound train, and then a stagecoach, and then, finally, a hired wagon that had lost its rear left wheel on the rutted eastern approach to the mountains. Cole found the wagon exactly where she had left it, canted at an awkward angle on the side of the road, with her trunk still roped in the bed and a pair of indifferent horses tied to a cottonwood nearby. He assessed the situation with a quick, practical eye, checking the axle before he reached for any tools, crouching down in the dust with the ease of a man whose knees had never had cause to complain about such things. And she noticed the way his back shifted under his shirt when he moved, the lean working machinery of him. She was 24 years old, and she had been married for 8 years, and she was not naive, and she was not the sort of woman who thought noticing a man's physical presence was something to be ashamed of. She noticed. She filed it away. She helped where she could, passing him tools when he asked for them, holding the wheel steady when he needed both hands free, and he thanked her each time with the simple directness that seemed to be his native language. It took the better part of 2 hours. The autumn light had shifted from gray to a pale amber by the time he had the new wheel seated and the axle checked and the brace set properly. He stood and brushed the dust from his trousers and looked at his work with the calm satisfaction of a man who expected things he built to hold. "That'll carry you into town and beyond," he said. "You'll want to get the axle looked at properly by a wheelwright before you take it over any serious grade, though." "Is there a wheelwright in Harlan Creek?" "Tom Aldridge, near the livery. Tell him Cole sent you." He helped her reload the wagon, such as it was, her trunk and a few boxes she had acquired in Billings, and he did it without making her feel like a burden, which was a thing she noticed precisely because she was not accustomed to it. When they were done, she looked at him in the fading afternoon light and said, "Thank you, Mr. Briggs. What do I owe you?" He shook his head. "Nothing. I can't accept that. The wheel and the brace, that's real money." "It is," he agreed, "and I'll pay it gladly." "Why?" He considered this as though it were a genuine question that deserved a genuine answer, rather than a dismissal dressed up as chivalry. "Because you needed help and I was there, and I had what was needed." "That's enough of a reason." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "It doesn't feel like enough reason to most people." "Most people aren't me," he said simply. She laughed. It came out of her suddenly and completely, and with the slightly startled quality of a laugh that hasn't been allowed out in a very long time, and he watched it happen with something quiet and careful moving behind his gray eyes. "No," she said. "I suppose they aren't." She climbed back up onto the wagon seat, and he stepped back, and she gathered the reins, and then she looked down at him one more time because something in her was not quite ready to ride away. "Will you be in Harlan Creek long?" she asked, and immediately felt the color move into her cheeks, because that was a very transparent thing to ask a stranger. "Few days," he said, without making her feel transparent at all. "I have a trapline in the high country north of here. Come down to resupply before winter sets in." "I see," she said. "I'll likely stop in at Agnes Pruitt's," he added, which was also a transparent thing to say, and the fact that he said it without apparent self-consciousness made her like him considerably more than she already did. She drove into Harlan Creek as the sun was going down behind the mountains, painting the sky in layers of gold and rose and deep bruised purple, and she thought about the way he had asked if she was all right before he asked anything else, and she thought about the fact that nobody had asked her that in a very long time either. Harlan Creek in 1874 was a town that had not yet fully made up its mind about what it wanted to be. It had the bones of permanence: a main street with a proper general store, a bank, a doctor's office, a small church with a bell that actually worked, a hotel and a saloon that shared a wall and a septic concern. But it also had the restless, unfinished quality of a place that was still being argued over by the wilderness and civilization, with the wilderness winning several of the outlying rounds. The mountains came down close on the northern side, real mountains, not the gentle hills that passed for mountains in the east, but the massive, indifferent, bone-colored stone of the Absaroka Range, wearing their first dusting of early snow on the highest ridges like a warning. Agnes Pruitt was a woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and a manner that reminded Eliza of a schoolteacher she had once admired: efficient, slightly frightening, ultimately fair. She read Ruth's letter of introduction twice, folded it precisely, and looked at Eliza over the top of her spectacles. "You have experience keeping accounts?" Agnes asked. "I managed my husband's household accounts for 8 years, Eliza said, "and I have a clear hand and I'm accurate with figures." "Can you lift a 50-pound flour sack?" "If I have to." Agnes almost smiled. "You'll start Monday. Room and board included in the arrangement for the first month. After that, we'll see how things stand. There's a room above the store. It's small, but it's tight and it's warm." It was both of those things. It had a single window that looked out over the mountains to the north, and a rope bed with a wool mattress and 2 good blankets, and a small iron stove that heated the space adequately even when the wind came down off the high country with real intent. Eliza stood at that window on her first night in Harlan Creek and looked at the mountains and felt, for the first time in years that she could clearly count, something that was not quite happiness but was in the neighborhood. A quiet, tentative sense that the future was not already decided, that she was standing at the beginning of something rather than the continuing middle of something she had not chosen. She thought briefly about Cole Briggs. She told herself firmly not to be foolish. She thought about him anyway. He came into the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after she had started work. She was behind the counter helping old Mrs. Pearson sort through bolts of flannel when the bell above the door rang and she looked up, and there he was, filling the doorway again in that particular way he had, and her heart did something uncharacteristically undisciplined in her chest. He saw her immediately. His face did not change in any dramatic way. He was not a dramatic man, but there was a small, definite shift in his expression, something that moved into his eyes like sunlight moving into a room when someone opens a curtain. "Morning," he said, walking toward the counter with the unhurried ease of a man who was never in a hurry because he had long since made peace with how long things actually took. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs," she said, and was pleased with herself for how level her voice was. Mrs. Pearson looked between them with the bright, unsubtle interest of a woman who had been married 40 years and knew the signs. "You can finish sorting those bolts, Mrs. Pearson," Eliza said, "and I'll be right back to help you." She moved to the other end of the counter and helped Cole work through his supply list: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, a good quantity of hard tallow candles, rifle ammunition, a new skinning knife to replace one he had broken. It was a practical list, the list of a man who knew exactly what he needed to survive a Montana winter at altitude and was not inclined to be frivolous about it. "How are you settling in?" he asked as she pulled the last of the coffee from the shelf. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Mrs. Pruitt is firm but fair, and the work suits me." "She said that about you too," he said. Eliza looked up. "She spoke to you about me?" "Ran into her at the feed store yesterday. She said her new girl from St. Louis had a good head for figures and didn't flinch when she was wrong." He paused. "I took that to be a compliment." "I believe it was the highest one she gives," Eliza said. There was a brief, easy silence between them, the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but is instead a kind of conversation conducted without words, and then he said, "Do you take a noon break?" 30 minutes, she said. 12 o'clock. "There's a decent place to eat at the hotel dining room," he said, "if you'd like company." She looked at him fully. He was looking back at her with the same directness he had turned on her that first morning, with nothing hidden and nothing performed, just the simple, forthright thing of a man who was asking for what he wanted and was willing to receive the answer whatever it was. "I would like that," she said. And that was how it began. They ate lunch together on Tuesday, and again on Thursday, because she had begun her noon break a few minutes early on Thursday and arrived at the hotel to find him already there, already seated at the corner table near the window, already drinking his coffee with the patient economy of a man who had simply decided he would be where he said he would be and wait as long as necessary. He told her about his work in the high country, and the way he talked about it was not the way men usually talked about their work, which was either with bombastic pride or dismissive modesty. He talked about it the way you talk about something you love, and also fully understand, with respect for its difficulty and genuine pleasure in its rewards. He had been trapping and hunting in the mountains north of Harlan Creek for nearly 5 years, he told her. Before that, he had been a ranch hand in Wyoming, and before that he had come west from Ohio at the age of 19 with very little money and a tremendous capacity for work, which had turned out to be sufficient. "Do you ever get lonely up there?" she asked, "in the high country alone?" He thought about it. She was already learning that this was one of his most reliable qualities. He thought about questions before he answered them, even simple ones, because he believed that questions deserved the respect of actual consideration. "Lonely is a word that covers too much ground," he said finally. "There are times I miss people. There are times the quiet gets so big it presses on you in ways that are uncomfortable. But lonely in the way people usually mean it, feeling unwanted or unseen, no, I don't feel that up there. The mountains don't have opinions about whether you belong." Eliza set down her fork. "That's a remarkable thing to say," she said quietly. "Is it? Most people need to be seen by other people. They need to matter to someone." "I didn't say I don't need that," he said. "I said the mountains don't make me feel unseen. People can do that. People are good at it." He looked at her with that steady gray gaze. "I think you know what I mean." She did. She knew exactly what he meant. "I spent 8 years in a house full of people," she said, "and I was one of the most invisible people I have ever met." It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in years, and the fact that it came out in a hotel dining room in a small Montana town over a plate of salt pork and beans to a man she had known for less than a week should have alarmed her. It did not alarm her. It felt instead like opening a window that had been painted shut for so long you had stopped noticing the room was airless. He did not respond with pity, which she would have resented. He did not respond with advice, which would have been unwelcome. He simply looked at her with the full attention of someone who was listening, really listening, in the way that is so rare it registers in the body as something almost physical. "You're not invisible now," he said. She looked down at her plate and felt the warmth move through her like the first sun of spring moving through cold ground, slow and deep and entirely involuntary. He came into the store on Friday to say he would be heading back up into the high country in 2 days, before the weather closed in fully. He said it straight, the way he said everything, without dressing it up or minimizing it. He was going. That was the fact. "I'll likely be down again before Christmas," he said, "if the passes stay open." "And if they don't?" she asked. "Then after Christmas." She nodded. She kept her face composed because she had had 8 years of practice at composed. "I hope the passes stay open," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the store hummed with its ordinary business, Agnes moving between shelves, a pair of ranch wives examining yard goods, the stove ticking against the early morning cold. "Before I go," he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right." He leaned slightly against the counter, and she could see the breadth of him, the capable solidity of him, and she thought again about how strange it was to be in the presence of someone whose physical reality was so utterly present and unconcealed. He was simply and completely himself, contained in his body the way mountains are contained in themselves, without apology or performance. "What do you want?" he asked. She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "From this," he said. "From being here. From Harlan Creek. What do you want for yourself?" The question landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, and she felt the rings of it expand outward in silence, touching all the far edges of places she had not been in a very long time. "What do you want?" She had been asked what she intended, and what she planned, and what she was doing, and what she needed to do, and what was expected of her. She had been told what she should want and guided toward wanting it, and corrected when her wanting wandered from the approved direction. But she could not, standing there in Agnes Pruitt's dry goods store on a Friday morning in October 1874, think of a single time in her adult life that anyone had simply asked her what she wanted, with no attached agenda or expected answer, no framework of duty or expectation built around the question like a cage. Nobody had ever asked her that before. The realization broke over her slowly, and then all at once, the way ice breaks in a spring river, and she felt the sudden alarming prick of tears at the backs of her eyes, which she absolutely was not going to allow. She swallowed. "I want to know what I want," she said finally, which was perhaps the most truthful answer she had ever given anyone. He did not look confused by this. He did not look impatient. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded at things he understood completely. "That seems like a good place to start," he said. He left on Sunday morning, heading north with his mule loaded and his rifle across his back, and she watched him go from the window above the store and felt the town contract slightly around his absence, the way a room feels when someone tall leaves it. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She made a list. It was not a shopping list or an accounts list or a task list, though she made those too. This was a different kind of list, written late at night by the light of a tallow candle on the back of a piece of brown paper she had taken from the store wrapping supply with Agnes's permission. She wrote at the top of it, in her careful, neat hand, "Things I want." She sat for a long time, staring at those 3 words. Then she began to write. She wanted to read books of her own choosing, without being told they were impractical. She had read voraciously as a girl, and had married a man who thought fiction was a waste of time, and any book that wasn't a ledger or a Bible was a suspicious luxury. She wanted to walk in the mountains. She had seen them for the first time from the window of the stagecoach coming into Billings, and they had hit her somewhere deep and immediate, the way a piece of music does sometimes when you hear it at exactly the right moment of your life. She wanted to have opinions, out loud, without the automatic softening and qualifying and self-deprecating that she had trained herself to perform in order to keep a household running smoothly. She wanted to learn things that had been considered outside her purview, how animals were tracked, how traps were set, how the weather could be read in the movement of clouds and the behavior of birds. She stopped. She looked at the list and laughed softly to herself in the candlelit quiet of her small room. Half of what she had written down sounded remarkably like wanting to know more about Cole Briggs's life. She did not cross it out. She carried on. October thickened into November, and the mountains showed more white each morning when she looked at them from her window. Harlan Creek settled into its winter rhythms, quieter, more self-contained, the nights coming early and the fires burning high, and the particular intimacy of a small community drawing in around itself against the cold. Eliza worked her days at the store, keeping the books and serving customers, and occasionally, when Agnes was otherwise occupied, managing the small but surprisingly complex social dynamics of a dry goods store in a western settlement where business and personal obligation and community politics were woven together in ways that required constant, careful attention. She was good at it, better than she had expected. She had skills she had not known she had because she had never been in a position to use them openly. She could soothe a difficult customer and keep the transaction moving without anyone feeling managed, and she had a memory for faces and names and preferences that made people feel noticed and valued. Agnes noticed. Agnes was not a woman who praised freely, but she stopped hovering over Eliza's shoulder after the second week, and by the end of October, she was leaving Eliza to manage the morning customers alone, which in Agnes's world was an extravagant expression of confidence. She made friends, slowly because she was not a rushing kind of person, and carefully because she had been burned before by friendships that turned out to be proximity mistaken for connection. But Ruth, her cousin, came into town twice a week from the small homestead she shared with her husband Henry outside of town, and their relationship, which had been mostly letter writing for the past decade, discovered that it was something warmer and more substantial in person. And there was Nora Aldridge, the wheelwright's wife, a sharp and funny woman of 30 who had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology. And Eliza found she loved this about her with a devotion that surprised her. She told Nora about Cole. She did not mean to. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon when she had stopped in at the Aldridge workshop to pay the balance of the wheelwright's bill, and Nora had insisted on tea. And somehow in the warmth of the workshop, with the tea and the smell of fresh-cut wood around them, the conversation had turned to the question of men and marriage, and what a woman did with herself in the middle of Montana after 8 years of invisibility. "There's a man," Eliza said, and then stopped because she had not planned to say that. Nora looked at her with the arrested attention of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this revelation. "Tell me everything." "There's very little to tell. He's a trapper. He was kind to me the day I arrived. We had lunch twice. He's gone up into the high country for the winter." "Cole Briggs," Nora said. Eliza stared at her. "You know him?" "Tom fixed a pack saddle for him last spring. He's a good man, Eliza. A genuinely good man, and in this territory that is not as common as you'd hope." Nora poured more tea without being asked. "He doesn't drink to excess. He doesn't start trouble. He's reliable about his accounts. And he's never once made me feel like furniture, which is more than I can say for half the men in this valley." Eliza wrapped both hands around her tin cup. "I don't know what to make of him," she said. "What does your instinct say?" "My instinct has been ignored so long I'm not sure I trust it." Nora looked at her with the direct compassion of a woman who understood things about other women that sometimes needed no elaboration. "Learn to trust it again," she said simply. December arrived with a series of storms that buried the lower passes in 4 feet of snow and turned the main street of Harlan Creek into a river of gray slush that froze overnight into ankle-breaking ridges. Eliza bundled herself in the wool coat she had bought from Agnes at a fair price and the good boots that Nora had recommended, and she walked to work and back, and on her days off she walked along the creek where the ice was forming in elaborate crystal patterns at the margins, and she read. She borrowed books from the small collection at the church hall and bought 2 more from a traveling bookseller who came through just before the worst of the weather closed in. She read a novel she had always wanted to read and had been told was frivolous. She sat up past the hour she should have been sleeping and read it by candlelight with her feet against the warm flank of the small stove, and nobody told her to put it away or asked her what possible use it was, and the simple animal pleasure of that, of reading what she wanted because she wanted to, was so acute it made her chest ache. She was thinking about this one afternoon when she heard the bell above the store door and looked up, and it was Cole. He looked thinner than she remembered, which was not surprising given the altitude and the cold and the months of living on what the mountain provided, but he also looked good, the way a person looks when they have been doing something that suits them, a kind of rightness in how they occupy their own skin. His cheeks were weathered red with cold, and his beard was fuller than it had been in October, and there was a scar she hadn't noticed before along the edge of his jaw, new enough to be pink. "You're earlier than Christmas," she said. "The lower pass stayed open longer than I expected," he said, "and I had a reason to come down." He was looking at her steadily when he said this, and she felt the directness of it land somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum. "There was a problem on the Eastern Trail," he said. "I came across a family, a woman and 2 children, coming up from Billings, their wagon stuck in a ditch 3 days out. I helped them through to town, figured as long as I was down." "As long as you were down," she agreed. "I thought I'd check in." "I'm glad you did." He came to the counter and she came around to the side where the space was slightly less formal, and they stood together and talked for the better part of an hour while the store did its quiet afternoon business around them, and it felt like resuming a conversation that had been paused rather than starting a new one. He told her about the high country in early winter, the way the world simplified itself, the way the cold made everything precise and clear. She told him about the store, and Nora and the books she had been reading, and when she told him about the novel she had been reading, the one she had been denied in her previous life, his face opened with genuine interest, and he asked her about it and actually listened to her answer. They walked out together when the store closed at dusk. The sky was the deep blue-green of a winter evening, and the first stars were coming in over the eastern ridge, and their breath made small clouds in the cold air, and he walked beside her up the main street with his hands at his sides and his shoulders carrying the ease of a man who was exactly where he had decided to be. "Will you have dinner with me?" he asked. "Properly, at the hotel." "I will," she said. "Tonight?" "Give me 20 minutes to change out of my work clothes." He smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face, not because he was severe without it, but because with it he was suddenly and completely warm, the winter sky opening to sunlight. "I'll be at the hotel," he said. That dinner lasted 3 hours. They moved from salt pork and beans to the apple pie that the hotel cook, Mrs. Ferris, made with local dried apples and a lard crust that was better than anything Eliza had eaten since her grandmother's table in Ohio. And they talked about everything that seemed important and some things that seemed trivial and important together. He told her about Ohio, and she told him about St. Louis, and they found that they had both come from places that had been too small for them in different but rhyming ways. He had been the son of a farmer who believed that land was all a man needed, and he had looked at the western horizon every morning of his boyhood and felt the pull of something larger than the county line. She had been the daughter of a merchant who believed that a woman's only real asset was a good marriage, and she had read every book she could get her hands on and dreamed in quiet, guilty private of a life that had more room in it. "Did you know?" he said. "When you married? Did you know it was wrong?" She thought about this with the same seriousness she was learning to apply to questions that deserved it. "I knew something was missing," she said. "I thought it was me. I thought I wasn't doing something right or feeling the right things or wanting the right things. It took me a very long time to understand that the absence wasn't my failure." "It wasn't," he said. "I know that now." "What changed?" She looked at him across the table in the warm, amber light of the hotel dining room. "Someone asked me what I wanted," she said. He held her gaze. He understood. He did not make it into more than it was, or less than it was. He simply received it, the way he seemed to receive most things, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who believed that what was real was worth attending to. "What's on your list?" he asked. She blinked. "My list? You look like the kind of person who made a list." She laughed, the same startled, liberated laugh she had given him in October, and he watched it again with the same quiet attention. "I did make a list," she admitted. "Tell me." She told him. She told him about the books and the mountains and the opinions and the learning things, and she told him the last part, the part about how half of it sounded like wanting to know more about his life. And she watched his face as she said it, watched the shift in his expression, the way the warmth in it intensified to something deeper and more deliberately directed. "That's easily arranged," he said. "Cole, I mean it, Eliza. I'd like to show you, if you want to see." The way he said it, not as a claim, not as a declaration of intent, but as an offering, a door held open from which she could walk through or not of her own choice, was so different from how men had usually spoken to her that it took her a moment to recognize it as what it was: genuine, simple, free of agenda. "I'd like to see," she said. December was the beginning of everything, really. He stayed in Harlan Creek through the holidays, which he told her was unusual for him. He normally spent Christmas alone in the high country and came down in January or February. But he had things to see to in town, he said, and she did not ask him to list those things because she was fairly certain she already knew what most of them were. He took her out on horseback on a clear, cold day between Christmas and the New Year, riding north of town where the mountains started properly, and he showed her how to read the country, how to see the signs of deer trails in the undisturbed snow, how to read the sky for weather coming off the high peaks, how to distinguish the tracks of a rabbit from a marten and a coyote from a fox. He was a patient teacher, methodical and clear, and he never once made her feel that what she was learning was unusual for a woman to want to know, which she found she needed in a way she had not anticipated. "The creek up ahead goes underground for about 60 feet under that rock formation," he said, pointing with his chin at a jumble of granite boulders capped with snow. "If you're ever traveling through here in summer and you're tracking water by sound, don't be surprised when it disappears. It comes back out on the other side." "How do you know all this?" she asked. "About this particular place?" "I've walked every inch of this valley, 5 years of it." He looked around at the mountains with the particular affection of someone who has earned a place through sustained attention. You know a place the way you know a person, one conversation at a time. She looked at him on horseback in the white winter landscape, big and dark against the snow, his breath coming in steady visible clouds, his horse entirely calm under him, and she thought that she was in very real danger of loving this man, and she found she was not as alarmed by this as she might have expected. They were riding back toward town in the late afternoon, the light going low and golden over the western mountains, when he reached across the distance between their horses and briefly took her gloved hand in his. He did not say anything. He held her hand for a moment and then released it and looked forward, and she looked forward too, and neither of them spoke, but the air between them had changed in some fundamental way, become something more specific and named. New Year came in with a snow squall and the sound of the saloon making considerable noise on the other side of Agnes's wall. Eliza lay in her narrow rope bed and listened to the wind working at the eaves and thought about the year that was ending. 8 months ago, she had been a widow in St. Louis, sitting beside a dead man's bed, feeling mostly silence. Now she was in a small room in Montana with the mountains visible from her window and a list of things she wanted that was getting longer all the time. And there was a man in this town who had looked at her and seen her entirely and without qualification from the first moment. She picked up her candle and found the piece of brown paper with her list on it, and she read through what she had written in October. Then she found a pencil and she added to the bottom of the list, in handwriting that was slightly less careful than her usual hand, because it was late and she was writing quickly before she lost her nerve. I want to know what it feels like to be loved by someone who actually wants to know me. She folded the paper and put it back in the small box under the bed where she kept it, and blew out the candle, and lay in the dark listening to the wind, and let herself want it without apology. Cole came to the store on the second morning of January with a proposition. He stood across the counter with his hat in his hands. He was one of the few men she had met who actually held his hat when he was being serious, rather than leaving it on his head. And he said that he was thinking about not going back to the high country, at least not for the rest of the winter. She kept her face composed. Is that so? I've been thinking about whether there might be a different way to make a living here in the valley, he said. Something that doesn't require being gone 8 months of the year. What kind of something? There's a piece of land north of town, about 4 miles up the creek. Good timber, good water, open pasture. I've had my eye on it for a couple of years. It would carry a decent horse operation, maybe some cattle. You want a ranch? She said. I want to build something that's worth coming home to, he said. He was looking at her when he said it, and the meaning was clear and plain and entirely undisguised, and she felt the warmth of it move through her chest like the first fire of the season in a cold hearth, immediate and necessary. Cole, she said. I know it's quick, he said. I know you're still working things out. I know you came here to find yourself and not to find someone else, and I'm not trying to put myself in the way of that. But I want you to know where I stand. Where do you stand? I'm standing in front of the woman I've thought about every day since October, he said, asking her what she wants. Still. That was when she came around from behind the counter, which she had never done for personal reasons during business hours, and she stood in front of him at close range and looked up into his gray eyes and felt the full weight of what was happening between them, the reality and significance of it, and said, I want you to stay. He put his hat on the counter and took her hands in both of his, and she felt the size of his hands around hers, the warmth and the solidity of them, and she thought that this was what it felt like to be held by someone who held things carefully. Then I'll stay, he said. He kissed her for the first time that evening, standing on the porch of Agnes's store in the January cold, with the mountains white in the moonlight behind him and the town going quiet around them. It was a deliberate, unhurried kiss, the kiss of a man who was sure of what he wanted and sure of what he was doing. And she kissed him back with all 8 years of suppressed wanting and all the new knowledge of what it felt like to be actually seen. And when they finally separated, she felt the cold air on her lips, and it was not cold at all. I should have asked, he said against her hair, slightly breathless. You did ask, she said. You've been asking from the beginning." He laughed, and she felt it in his chest, and she thought she could stand in this exact spot for a considerable length of time without complaint. January proceeded with the steady, layered accumulation of two people who had decided to know each other. He was not yet out at the land north of town. The snow was too deep for any serious building work. But he had filed the claim with the county office in the nearest district seat, and he had spent time up at the property with Tom Aldridge, talking about what the land would support and what would need to be done in spring. He came into the store most mornings, and they had coffee together before Agnes opened, and on Sunday afternoons he borrowed 2 horses from the livery, and they rode out in whatever weather the week had delivered. She was becoming a decent rider, which she found she liked more than she had expected. There was something about being on horseback in open country that arranged her thoughts in a way that nothing else quite did. The rhythm of it, the obligation of it, the way it required your full attention without demanding anything more than attention. He bought a book for her in February, from a trader passing through from the east, with a crate of goods that included, improbably, a selection of novels. He chose carefully, he told her. He had stood at the trader's wagon for nearly half an hour, looking through the available titles and trying to think about what she would like, not what he thought she should like, which was a distinction she noted with a warm, private recognition. She read it in 4 days and told him about every part of it, and he listened with the full attention he brought to everything she said, asking questions that showed he had actually been thinking about what she told him rather than simply waiting for her to finish. "You would have been a scholar," he said one evening, watching her trace an argument in a book with the focused energy she brought to ideas she found compelling. "My father thought that was amusing," she said without bitterness. "Your father was wrong," he said simply. She looked up at him. There was no anger in it, and no crusade in it, just the simple statement of a man correcting a factual error. "Yes," she said. He was. Spring came to the valley in the gradual, tentative way spring always comes to high country. One warm day followed by 2 cold ones, the creek ice breaking and refreezing, the aspens putting out the first pale green intimation of leaves before pulling back again as a late frost came through. By April, the mud season had turned the road north of town into a navigable disaster, but Cole was out at the land regardless, working from first light with Tom Aldridge and 2 hired hands he had taken on, a pair of brothers named Soren and Arvid Halverson, who had come down from the Norwegian settlement near Helena, and who worked with the focused efficiency of people who had been taught early that effort was its own sufficient reward. Eliza rode out on Saturdays. She watched the cabin take shape. Cole had designed it himself, a single large room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace wide enough to cook in, built from the timber on the property and chinked with the clay from the creek bank. He had asked her opinion on every element of it, which she had first thought was politeness and had gradually come to understand was entirely genuine. He wanted to know what she thought. He adjusted plans based on what she said. When she pointed out that the window placement on the south wall would mean afternoon shade in the sleeping area, he moved the window. When she suggested the kitchen corner should be larger because she liked to cook and wanted room to do it properly, he made the kitchen corner larger. The cabin was, in some fundamental way, a collaboration, and every time she recognized this, she felt something steady and solid accumulate in her chest, a kind of certainty about who this man was and what his regard for her actually meant. "You know," Nora said on a May afternoon when they were walking along the creek together, "half the town is expecting an announcement." "Half the town can wait," Eliza said, but she was smiling. "What about the other half of the town?" "The other half can also wait." But she was thinking about it. She had been thinking about it with increasing regularity since January, and her thinking had arrived at a particular clarity. She was not afraid of loving him, and she was not confused about whether she did, and she was not uncertain about whether he loved her in return, because he had told her, simply and directly as he told her everything, on a February evening when the snow was heavy and the store was quiet, and they were sitting together by the stove with coffee. "I love you," he had said. I wanted to say it properly, not surrounded by other things. And she had looked at him and felt the full, unprecedented luxury of receiving that statement from someone she believed completely, and said, "I love you too. I wanted you to know it's not gratitude." He had frowned slightly. "I know that." I needed to say it anyway, because I spent a long time doing things out of obligation, and I want to be very clear that this is not that. What is it? It's what I want, she said. On the list. It's on the list. He had taken her face in both his hands, those warm, capable hands, and kissed her with a care and an intention that said everything about who he was and what she meant to him, and she had let herself be entirely present for it, without self-consciousness or qualification, without the interior managing that had been her lifelong habit. It was the most present she had felt in her own life, in as long as she could remember. He asked her to marry him in May, in the meadow behind the half-finished cabin, with the mountains still carrying snow on the upper ridges and the lower pasture going green with the first warm weather. He had ridden out from town with her on a Saturday morning and walked her to the back of the property, where the land opened out into a natural clearing bordered by a stand of aspen and a curve of the creek. And it was the kind of place that makes you catch your breath a little, the unreasonable beauty of it, the sense of the world showing off without any particular audience in mind. He stopped in the middle of the meadow and turned to face her, and she saw in his face that the moment was deliberate and specific, that he had brought her here on purpose and intended to say something of weight. He had not brought a ring, which she would find out later, was because he had wanted her to choose it herself. He would tell her this afterward, simply, because it had seemed to him that of course she should choose her own ring, and he had looked faintly surprised that she found this noteworthy, as if it hadn't occurred to him that it was not standard practice. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You're always asking me things," she said softly. "I'm always asking because your answers matter to me." He took both her hands in his. "Will you marry me, Eliza? Will you make a life here with me? I want to know what you think about everything, and I want to sit next to you by the fire for the next 40 years, and I want to build something with you that is ours together, not mine that you join. Ours." She stood in the May meadow with the aspen leaves trembling in the light and looked up at him, at the strong, open face of him, at the steady gray eyes that had never once looked through her, and thought of the piece of brown paper in the box under her bed, and the list on it, and the thing she had written in the dark on New Year's Eve. "I want to know what it feels like to be loved by someone who actually wants to know me." "Yes," she said. He pulled her into his arms then, both arms, wrapping her in the warmth and the solidity of him, and she felt the strength of him all around her, and buried her face against his chest, and felt the deep ground-level relief of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally been able to put it down. They were married in the church in Harlan Creek on a Saturday in late June, 1875. Ruth was there with Henry, and Nora and Tom Aldridge, and Agnes Pruitt, who wore her Sunday dress and sat in the front row and looked at Eliza with an expression that was as close to maternal pride as Agnes Pruitt had likely ever allowed herself in public. The Halverson brothers stood at the back of the church looking scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good shirts, which Soren had clearly pressed that morning with more enthusiasm than expertise. The minister, a young man named Reverend Hale, who had come to Harlan Creek from Vermont 6 months ago and was still visibly working out what the territory required of him, conducted the ceremony with genuine feeling, if somewhat unpolished delivery. Eliza wore the blue dress she had bought from Agnes in early spring, a good, honest blue, not a wedding white, because she had been married in white before, and this was something different, something she was choosing with full knowledge and full intention. And she had wildflowers in her hair because Nora had insisted, and she had found she agreed with Nora's insistence once she saw the result in the small mirror in her room. Cole wore his good clothes, which were not formal by any strict measure of the word, but were pressed and clean, and he had trimmed his beard and his dark chestnut hair was tied back. And when she walked down the aisle of the small church and saw him standing at the front waiting for her, she saw that he was looking at her the exact way he had looked at her from the first, directly, openly, as if she were the most complete and interesting thing in the room. She was. When the Reverend asked the question, Eliza said her vow in a clear, steady voice, looking directly at Cole the whole time, meaning every word with the full weight of a woman who understood exactly what she was saying and to whom. He said his in a low, unhurried voice, and she heard in it all the quality of the man, the steadiness and the directness and the genuine, uncomplicated affection that had been the consistent fact of him since the first morning in the trading post. Nora cried. Agnes Pruitt dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and then looked around to see if anyone had noticed, and then straightened her spine considerably. They had a small celebration at the hotel afterward. Mrs. Ferris had made an apple cake and a proper ham, and there was good coffee and a bottle of wine that someone had brought from the East, and everyone stood around in the warm light of the hotel dining room and felt the simple communal pleasure of a thing being right. Cole found her in the brief quiet of a moment between conversations and put his hand at the small of her back and said, near her ear, "Are you happy?" She turned and looked at him. This man who had walked through a door in October and looked at her as though she were something worth seeing. "I'm happy," she said. And then, because it was true and he deserved to hear it, and she was no longer a woman who kept true things inside. Genuinely happy. For the first time that I can remember clearly. He kissed her temple, and she felt the warmth of it, and around them the celebration went on, gentle and golden, and outside through the hotel windows, the summer evening was long, and the mountains were still bright. They moved into the cabin the following week. It was finished to a working standard. The fireplace drew well, the roof was tight, the sleeping loft was warm and private, and Cole had made a proper bed frame for it, wide and solid, with a rope base and a good mattress he had ordered from Billings, and which had arrived miraculously in one piece. There were still details to be done over the coming months: proper shelving, a covered porch on the south side, the chicken coop and the smokehouse, and eventually a barn. But it was a real home, functional and warm, and it sat in its clearing by the creek with the aspens around it and the mountains behind. And every morning, Eliza could look north from the kitchen window and see the high peaks and feel the pull of them, which was no longer the yearning of a woman looking at a place she couldn't reach, but the simple pleasure of a person looking at the mountains she lived beside. Cole began acquiring horses in early summer. 3 mares to start with, good solid mountain stock from a rancher named Kellerman, who was reducing his operation before moving south, and a young stallion with the kind of bone structure and temperament that suggested he had been well considered before being well bred. He knew horses with the same careful intelligence he brought to everything, reading them the way he read weather or terrain, making his assessment from a quiet, observant distance before he ever moved to touch. She watched him work with the stallion one afternoon in the newly fenced paddock, and she thought that this was one of the most essentially him things she had ever witnessed: his patience, his silence, the way he waited for the animal to come to him rather than pressing forward on his own timeline, and how when the horse finally walked to him and accepted his hand, it was because he had earned it completely. She wrote this in her journal that evening. She had started keeping one in February, on Nora's suggestion, and with the realization that she had thoughts worth keeping track of. The journal was another item that had been quietly added to the list, a record of what it felt like to be present in her own life. Summer turned the valley lush and brilliant. The creek ran full and cold off the snowmelt, and the aspen grove behind the cabin was deep green in the long afternoons, and Eliza planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the cabin and was inordinately pleased by it, by the rows of beans and squash and the herbs that grew in the sheltered corner where the fireplace chimney threw warmth even on cool evenings. She had gardened as a girl, before her father had moved the family into a city house where there was no garden, and she had not realized until she was on her knees in the Montana soil in June how much she had missed it, how the weight of the dirt in her hands and the smell of growing things was connected to some bedrock part of herself. She told Cole about this at dinner one evening, about the childhood garden and what it had meant and what it meant now, and he listened with the full attention he always brought to her and then said quietly, "We should expand it next year, up the east slope where the sun is longer." "You'd let me take that ground?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Eliza, this is your land as much as mine. This is your life as much as mine. You don't need my permission for the garden." She knew this. Rationally, legally, she knew it. He had insisted when they were establishing the property that her name be on the claim alongside his, which Tom Aldridge had told her was not as common a practice as it should be, and Cole had looked mildly baffled when Tom mentioned this, as if the idea that it would be otherwise had not genuinely occurred to him. She knew it, but she still caught herself asking for permission for things she had every right to decide alone, a reflex so deeply trained it operated below thought, and every time Cole responded to it the way he did, without making her feel foolish for the reflex, without dwelling on it, simply redirecting to the reality. She felt another layer of the old habit loosen and release. "Up the east slope," she said. "Yes, I'll plan it out over the winter." "Tell me what you need and I'll dig the beds in early spring," he said. They were in the particular domestic ease of a summer evening, the light going warm and low through the cabin windows, the meal finished, Cole with his coffee and his own reading at the table, Eliza with her journal in the chair by the fireplace. This was what life had become, and it was so ordinary and so specifically what she had wanted without knowing how to name it that she sometimes had to simply stop and register it. This is real. This is what it is. This is mine. She had written to her parents in St. Louis in March, a careful letter, factual and honest, telling them where she was and what she was doing, and that she had married again, to a man named Cole Briggs, a rancher in Montana. Her mother had written back with cautious good wishes and considerable questions. Her father had not written at all, which was a kind of answer in itself, but she found it did not hurt as much as it once would have. She was building something here that did not require his approval to stand. By August, the horse operation was genuinely underway, with 3 more mares purchased and the stallion proving himself everything Cole had assessed him to be. They had acquired the land formally, 460 acres running from the main creek up into the lower timber, and Cole had applied for the additional homestead acres under the terms of the Homestead Act, and the Halverson brothers were still on as hired hands, having decided that Harlan Creek was as good a place as they had found and better than most. On a warm August evening when the sky went every color from gold to deep rose to violet over the western mountains, Cole and Eliza sat on the newly finished south porch with coffee, and the horses moved quietly in the paddock below, and the aspens were just beginning to show the first faintest hints of yellow at the edges of their leaves, the first whisper of the autumn that was coming. "Are you content?" he asked. It was a different question than the ones he usually asked, content rather than happy. Content was deeper, she thought. Happiness was an event, contentment was a condition. She thought about it properly, the way he had taught her without meaning to, by always thinking things properly himself. "Yes," she said, genuinely, fully. She looked at the mountains. "I didn't know it was possible to be this satisfied by simply being where you are." "You were never where you were before," he said. She looked at him. "You were always somewhere slightly to the side of your own life," he said. "I could see it from the first day. You were managing things from a distance, looking in from outside. And now? Now you're here," he said. "Right here." She reached across and took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers, and she thought, "Yes, right here. This is exactly right." In October, a year after she had driven into Harlan Creek with a broken wagon wheel and her whole life in a trunk, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected it for about 2 weeks before she was certain, and she spent those 2 weeks in a state of quiet, internal reckoning that she recorded in her journal with unusual care, wanting to be honest with herself about what she felt before she said anything to anyone else. She had not wanted children in her first marriage, not because she didn't want them in principle, but because she had been unwilling to bring children into a household where she herself felt so profoundly unseen, where the atmosphere was so fundamentally one of endurance rather than thriving. She had not understood then that this was what she had felt. She had told herself she was not ready, that the time was not right, that these things could wait. Now she understood that she had been protecting a potential future person from the life she had been living without having the vocabulary to know that was what she was doing. Now she sat in the kitchen of the cabin she had helped design, in the life she had chosen with her full self, and she felt the possibility of a child in this context, in this life, with this man, and what she felt was clear, uncomplicated, ready. She told Cole on a Sunday morning, sitting across the breakfast table from him with the mountains visible through the north window and the smell of the coffee between them. She told him directly, the way she told him everything now, and she watched his face as she said it. The shift in his expression was something she would not have been able to describe adequately, but she felt it in her own chest, a kind of expansion, a warmth that moved through him visibly, a brightness in the gray eyes that she had not seen before. He set down his coffee cup carefully, the way he did things when he was very sure he wanted his full attention on what was happening, and he looked at her across the table. How do you feel about it?" he asked. "You feel?" Because of course that was the first question, not his feelings, hers. She felt the familiar, still surprising gift of being asked. "Happy," she said, frightened, but happy. He came around the table and she stood, and he put his arms around her and held her with a gentleness calibrated precisely to what the moment needed. Not too careful, not performatively tender, just the real and specific warmth of a man who was profoundly, simply glad. "Whatever you need," he said against her hair. "You tell me, and we'll make sure you have it." "I know," she said. "I know I can tell you." The autumn of 1875 passed in the warmth of that knowledge, that new, growing fact inside her that was part of both of them. She continued working for Agnes through the early months, though she reduced her days when the winter cold made the ride into town harder. Agnes, who had no children of her own and seemed to regard this new development with an emotion she would not directly name, became increasingly solicitous in ways that she would certainly have denied if challenged, making sure the store was warm and that Eliza was not lifting anything heavy, and once, memorably, arriving at the cabin with a jar of preserved ginger and the gruff explanation that it helped with the morning difficulty, which Eliza accepted with the diplomatic gratitude she had learned was the correct response to Agnes Pruitt's acts of covert love. Cole built the baby's crib in November, working in the evenings by lamplight with the care and precision he brought to everything structural, using the good pine from the property's timber and pegging it rather than nailing it, because peg joints were sounder. He showed her the work each evening as it progressed, and she traced the smoothed wood with her fingers and thought about who would sleep in it. She had started talking to the baby, which she told Nora with a slight embarrassment, and which Nora confirmed she had done the same with both of her own children with no ill effects noted. "Does Cole know you talk to him?" Nora asked. "Him?" "I just assume," Nora said, with the serenity of a woman who had accurate instincts and no particular investment in pretending otherwise. Eliza had not told Cole about the talking, but she had told Cole essentially everything else, so she told him that evening, and he looked at her with the warm, open expression she loved most in him, the one that said he found her fully and completely wonderful. And then he leaned forward and addressed the topic of the talking directly toward her abdomen and said, "Your mother is remarkable. I want you to know that early." She laughed until she cried, which was, she had discovered, an entirely common condition of late pregnancy, and he held her through both with equal and uncomplicated steadiness. Nathaniel Cole Briggs was born in the late afternoon of a cold, clear day in January 1876, during the exact quality of winter light that turns everything amber in particular, the kind of light that feels as though the world has simplified itself down to the essential things. Dr. Hennessy from Harlan Creek was present, and Nora, who had been at the cabin since early morning when it became clear the time was coming. Cole was present as well, which the doctor noted was unusual, and which Cole regarded as non-negotiable without saying so directly. He held Eliza's hand through the long hours of it, the solid, warm reality of his grip and anchor throughout, and when it was over, and the doctor placed the baby in her arms, she looked at the small, miraculous, absolutely determined face of the person who had just arrived in the world and felt the full force of a love that had no precedent in anything she had known before. She looked up at Cole, who was looking at the baby with an expression she had never seen on him, entirely undone, entirely open, the careful steadiness of him dissolved in something larger and more complete. And she said, "Nathaniel." He looked at her. "Nathaniel," he agreed, and his voice had changed slightly, gone rough with what he was feeling. He put his hand very gently on the baby's head, his big, rough hand on that small head, and the gentleness of it, the precise, absolute gentleness of a very strong person being as careful as care itself, was one of the most beautiful things Eliza had ever seen. The winter of 1876 was the first winter she had ever spent that felt like the right weather for her life. The cabin was warm and well-provisioned, and Nathaniel grew with the busy, concentrated determination of a new person learning the world. And Cole was present in all the ways that mattered, not just for the practical demands of a new baby, which he took on with the same matter-of-fact competence he brought to everything requiring effort, but in the smaller, sustaining ways. He got up in the night without being asked. He watched the baby on the afternoons when she needed to sleep or to simply be a person alone for an hour. He learned what worked and what didn't, with the same patient attentiveness he brought to horses and weather and land, and he reported his findings to Eliza as though they were colleagues working on a mutual project, which they were. She told him one February evening, while Nathaniel slept in the crib Cole had made, and the snow fell softly outside, and the fire was high and warm, that she had never expected this, not this specific combination of things, the life and the place and the person, and that she was not sure she had believed it was possible, this particular quality of being known and happy at once. "It's possible," he said. "You just needed someone to clear the ground first." "We cleared it together," she said. "You did the harder part," he said. She opened her mouth to argue this and then thought about the 8 years before, and closed it again. Perhaps she had done the harder part, and perhaps that was all right, and perhaps the fact that it was behind her and not in front of her was the significant thing. Spring came again, the valley's second spring since she had arrived, and it felt different from the first, more fully hers, more deeply familiar. She knew which wildflowers came up first in the meadow behind the cabin and where the deer came to water at first light. She knew the way the creek sounded different when the runoff was high versus when the summer slowed it. She knew the names of her neighbors in the surrounding valley and something of their histories and circumstances, because she had become, over the past year and a half, a woman who knew her community, who was known in it, who existed in it as a full participant rather than an appendage to someone else's life. She expanded the kitchen garden that spring, up the east slope as they had planned, and Cole dug the beds in early April while Nathaniel watched from the carrier on Cole's back with the imperious attention of a baby who considered everything his business and most of it fascinating. The three of them worked in the spring light, Cole digging, Eliza turning compost into the new beds, Nathaniel presiding, and it was so ordinary and so specific and so entirely what she wanted that she stopped in the middle of carrying a basket of compost and simply stood in the April sun and felt it. Cole looked up and saw her standing there. "What is it?" "Nothing," she said. "Everything. I was just feeling it." He understood. He always understood. He went back to digging, and she went back to composting, and Nathaniel continued his administrative observations, and the mountains stood over all of it in their enormous, indifferent, beautiful certainty. The horse operation grew that second year into something genuinely substantial. 12 horses by summer's end, a reputation across the valley for quality that was bringing buyers from as far as Billings, and Cole's careful breeding decisions beginning to show their logic in the young animals coming up. He had an instinct for horses that was close to art, and watching it operate, watching him assess a horse with the combination of knowledge and genuine feeling, the marriage of expertise and care, was one of the sustained pleasures of her daily life. She had also, by the summer of 1876, begun to help with the books for the horse operation, bringing her talent for figures and accounts to what had previously been managed in Cole's somewhat rough-and-ready ledger system. Cole handed this over with evident relief and zero resistance, and Eliza found that she had an aptitude for the particular complexity of a livestock operation's finances that went beyond simple arithmetic. She understood instinctively how to track the relationship between investment and return, how to plan for seasonality, how to assess risk. Cole listened to her analyses with the same attention he brought to her opinions about window placement and book recommendations and everything else, and they made decisions together, the two of them at the table with the ledger and the lamp, talking through the numbers and the strategies and the plans. This was the marriage she had not known was possible. Not a diminishment or a circumscription, but a collaboration, an enlargement. She was more herself in it than she had ever been outside it. In August of that year, she found a letter that had been waiting for her at the trading post for 3 weeks. The trading post delivered mail only when someone was going in its direction, and the Briggs homestead was a bit out of the way. The letter was from her mother in St. Louis, written in the tentative, careful hand of a woman who was attempting something she was not certain would be received. Her father had died in May, the letter said, a stroke, sudden. He had not suffered. She sat with this for a long while. She thought about the list she had made and what was on it and what was not on it, and the particular shape of grief that is not grief for the person, but for the possibility of the person, for the conversation that now could never happen, the recognition that would not come. She told Cole that evening. She told him all of it, not just the news, but the texture of what she felt, the complicated, unsentimental truth of a grief that did not look the way grief was supposed to look. He sat with her and listened, and did not try to tell her how she should feel or rush her through the feeling. "I think," she said finally in the quiet, "that I grieved for him for a long time before this. I think I spent a lot of years mourning the father he didn't manage to be." "That's an honest thing to know about yourself," Cole said. "It doesn't feel entirely comfortable." "It doesn't have to be comfortable to be true." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and she felt the steady warmth of him, the unfailing reliability of him, and she wrote to her mother the next morning with genuine care and feeling, and invited her to come to Montana whenever she wished. Her mother came the following spring in 1877 and stayed for 6 weeks, which was the longest Eliza had spent with her since childhood, and which turned out to be a revelation of a particular kind. Her mother was a woman who had made different choices than Eliza and would have made them again, but she was not incapable of love or of change, and she arrived at the cabin and saw Eliza's life and the person Eliza had become, and something in her face softened and opened. She held Nathaniel with the particular quality of attention that grandmothers bring to their first grandchildren, that absolute and uncomplicated devotion, and Nathaniel, who was by this point over a year old and had the solid, curious, confident personality that comes from being raised by people who are genuinely present, accepted his grandmother's devotion with the equanimity of someone who had expected no less. She watched Cole with a careful, assessing attention for the first several days, and on the 4th day she came to Eliza in the kitchen and said, in the low, private voice of a woman, saying something she meant fully but was not used to saying, "He looks at you as though you're worth looking at." Eliza stirred the pot she was working on and said, "He does." "I'm glad you found that," her mother said. It was the closest her mother had ever come to an apology, and Eliza recognized it as such and accepted it as such, in the same quiet, practical spirit in which Cole accepted most things, not dismissing it, not making more of it than it was, simply receiving it and putting it in its right place. The summer of 1877 was full and rich, the horse operation at the most successful point it had yet reached, the garden abundant beyond what she had planned for, the community of Harlan Creek growing and changing around them as the territory continued to fill. There were more families in the valley now, more children in the small schoolhouse that had been built the previous year, more commerce on the main street of town. It was not the wild, unsettled thing it had been when she arrived 3 years ago. It was becoming something more fixed and mapped, but it retained its essential character, the character of a place still being argued over by human intention and natural indifference. And she loved it for this. She had become, over these years, a woman of the territory in a way that was genuine, rather than adopted. She could ride well, and she could read weather, and she could manage a supply list for a winter at altitude, and she knew how to treat a horse's hoof infection, and she could find her way home through the aspen grove in the dark by the sound of the creek. These were not the skills she had anticipated needing 3 years ago in St. Louis, but they were hers, acquired by choice and use, and the patient guidance of a man who believed that knowledge had no natural owners and that competence was a form of dignity. She was pregnant again by autumn, which she had suspected since August, and which she confirmed with the same private reckoning she had undertaken before, checking with herself, listening to what she actually felt, before she said anything to anyone. What she felt was delight. She told Cole on a Saturday morning on the south porch, with Nathaniel asleep inside after an energetic morning of trying to assist with the horses, and Cole still finishing his coffee. She told him simply, because this was how they told each other things. He set down his coffee cup for the second time in their shared history, and looked at her with the same expansion, the same warmth, the same brightness, and she thought, yes, this is still who he is, this is still what it means to him. Some people become habituated to their good fortune and lose the sense of it. He had not. He would not. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "The same as last time," she said. "Happy? Frightened?" "The frightened is smaller this time." "Good," he said. "That's how it should work." He reached across and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and behind them inside the cabin, Nathaniel made the particular noise he made when he was waking from sleep, a sort of indignant arriving sound, as if rejoining the world was something he was doing under protest, but with full commitment. And they both smiled at it, the private, familiar smile of two people who share the specific comedy and wonder of a small person they have made together. "I'll build the crib bigger this time," Cole said. "The baby doesn't come bigger," she said. "He might," he said. "He," she said. "She," he said. They looked at each other and laughed. Margaret Ruth Briggs arrived in April 1878, on a morning of considerable snow that delayed the doctor but not the baby, who had opinions about her own timeline that she would go on to hold throughout her subsequent life with consistent firmness. Cole delivered her, which was not what either of them had planned, but which he managed with the same steadiness he managed everything, following the doctor's instructions that Nora had memorized and repeated with extraordinary calm, his hands doing what needed doing with the gentleness that was in him at the bedrock level, the gentleness that you don't learn but are. She was small and very loud, and had dark hair like her father, and a forthright, assessing quality to her gaze that announced itself from the first day as a feature, not a phase. "She's looking at me," Cole said, sitting on the edge of the bed with the baby in his arms, "as if she's deciding whether I meet the standard." "Do you think you do?" Eliza asked, exhausted and completely happy. "I intend to earn it," he said. She looked at them, her husband holding their daughter in the April snow light, the mountains outside the window, Nathaniel asleep in the next room, the smell of the kitchen garden soil coming up through the open crack of the window. And she thought about the woman she had been in October 1874, standing in a trading post in trail dust, holding a broken wagon, spoke, believing she was invisible. She had not known then that she was not invisible. She had not known that someone was about to walk through a door and look at her as though she were entirely worth seeing. She had not known that the reason nobody had ever asked her what she wanted was not because she wasn't worth asking, but because she had been surrounded by people who didn't know how to ask, people who had not yet learned, or would never learn, the fundamental thing that Cole Briggs had understood instinctively, which was that a person's wanting is important. A person's wanting is the center of them. To ask what someone wants, and then to genuinely listen to the answer, to let the answer change what you do, to build your life in consideration of it, is one of the most complete forms of love there is. She had not known any of this in October 1874. She knew all of it now. She knew it in the way you know something that is held in the body as well as the mind, that has been demonstrated and confirmed and built into the daily architecture of your life until it is as structural as the walls of the cabin and the sound of the creek and the sight of the mountains at morning. Margaret made a sound of imperial demand in Cole's arms, and he responded to it with immediate attention, and Eliza watched her husband with their daughter and felt the life she was living settle around her with the completeness of something that had found its final right shape. The years ahead of them were full and good. The horse operation became one of the most respected in the valley. Nathaniel grew into a boy of boundless energy and precise observation, with his mother's instinct for figures and his father's patience with living things, and he spent his days between the schoolhouse and the paddock with equal enthusiasm. Margaret grew into a person of such definite and expressed opinion that she occasionally startled visitors, who were not expecting that degree of conviction from a small girl, and which her parents encouraged completely. They added the covered porch, and the barn, and the smokehouse. They added 2 more rooms to the cabin when the children needed them. They added a proper kitchen garden tool shed that Eliza designed herself and Cole built to her specifications, and she planted the east slope with the extended beds they had planned, and grew enough in the summer to carry them well through winter with good preserved food. She continued writing in her journal, a practice that had become as essential to her daily life as the work and the walking and the coffee in the morning. She filled 3 notebooks and started a 4th, and when Nathaniel was old enough to ask what she was writing, she told him honestly, "The account of a life, what happened and what it felt like and what it meant." "What does it feel like?" he asked with the particular earnestness of a 6-year-old who has decided to take language seriously. She thought about it properly, because he deserved the real answer. "It feels like being exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. He considered this with his father's considering expression, that slight thoughtful pause before the engagement. "I feel that way too," he said, which was, she decided, one of the finest things she had ever been told. In the autumn of 1880, they made the ride she had been wanting to make since she had first seen the mountains, up into the high country north of the cabin, the real high country, the altitude where Cole had spent 5 winters alone before he had come down to find a reason to stay. They hired Nora and Tom's oldest daughter to stay with the children for 3 days, and they packed their supplies on 2 mules and rode north into the mountains on a morning of extraordinary clear cold, the kind of morning that makes the sky look higher and bluer than is quite credible. The world simplified itself at altitude, exactly as he had told her it would. The forest thinned and the rock came through and the air went thinner and cleaner and the sounds changed, becoming larger and more specific. The wind in the high timber was different from the wind in the valley, more purposeful, more ancient. She rode beside Cole on the trail that his years of traveling had made familiar to him, and he told her the name of every rock formation and every drainage and every species of tree, the accumulated geography of a private world that he had known alone for years and was now, finally, sharing. They made camp at the lake he had told her about, a high alpine lake cradled in a bowl of granite, fed by snowmelt, impossibly blue, surrounded by meadows that in summer would be full of wildflowers, but in October were the tawny gold of gone-to-seed grasses. They made a fire and sat beside it in the evening with the whole sky overhead, the stars at altitude being something else entirely from what the sky showed you in the valley, closer and more various and enormously, almost unbearably clear. "This is where you came to not be lonely," she said. "This is where I came to be present," he said. "The mountains don't ask you to perform anything. You're just there, and they're just there, and that's the whole of it." She looked at the lake and the stars and the granite and felt the truth of this, the specific quality of a place that accepts you entirely without requiring you to be any particular thing. "I understand now," she said, "why you loved it." "I love it better with you here," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and she felt the warmth of him against the high-altitude cold, and she looked at the stars and thought about all the distances she had traveled, the geographic distance from St. Louis to Montana, the interior distance from the woman she had been to the woman she was, and all the specific moments of that journey, every conversation and choice and revelation that had brought her to this particular spot on this particular mountain beside this particular man. She had not known at the beginning what she wanted. She knew now. She knew it in the full and specific and inhabited way that only comes from having lived the answer, from having had the question asked and having taken it seriously and worked out the answer through the practical and actual experiment of your own life. She wanted this. Exactly and completely this. "Cole," she said. He said into her hair. "Thank you for asking." He knew what she meant. He always knew what she meant. "Thank you for answering," he said. The fire burned low, and the stars turned in their great slow wheel overhead, and the lake lay in its granite bowl without opinion or agenda, and the mountains held their enormous, indifferent, beautiful position against the night sky, and the two of them sat beside the fire in the high country, and were exactly where they were, fully, completely, with nothing held back and nothing withheld, and nothing left standing between them and the life they had made together. There was nothing she wanted that she did not have. There was nothing she needed that was not here. The night went on in its quiet, star-filled mountain way, and she stayed where she was, present, known, wholly herself, and did not want to be anywhere else in the world.